Today we're going to be looking at Introduction to Agriculture. This basically is the first class of the Unit 2 Environmental Science. So this picture gives an example of agriculture, and this probably is an example of small-scale commercial agriculture. Some people are doing it probably to supplement their incomes. The amount of money they generate this way is probably fairly small. But what we notice, well, for example, we notice that the fencing is fairly cheap, so it's, as I said, fairly small scale. And the total area for farming is probably small, which means the environmental impact will be low. I suppose the issue here is that in a country like Jamaica, many people do a bit of farming on the side. And the issue really is collectively, the impact might be considerable. We'd have to work it out. Although the impact on one farm itself is probably fairly low. Also, we notice here we have what is called intercropping. We have different crops. So we have lettuce. This looks like a type of cabbage, onion, probably more lettuce. In the back we have some fruit trees. And so having many crops is called intercropping. And intercropping is beneficial because different crops have different pests and parasites. So by growing different crops, it prevents one particular disease from spreading. Also, different crops remove different nutrients from the soil. And therefore, in different years, you can rotate the crops into different strips. Therefore, using crop rotation. And therefore, again, less stress is put on the soil because different nutrients are going to be taken out each year. And there'll be different pathogens in the soil associated with each crop. So no pathogen can get hold. By growing crops in strips, like strip farming here, it reduces the chances of soil erosion, because sheet erosion is going to be minimized by the changes in the type of crop grown. So strip farming is a means of retaining soil and preventing erosion. And we know this land is slightly sloping, so erosion would occur. I suppose also by growing trees. Trees have deep roots and therefore they can remove nutrients from deep in the soil and bring it into the leaves, which then fall. So it facilitates the recycling of nutrients. So this farming here is probably has sustainable practices. We don't know really what they use for irrigation. If they've harvested rainwater somewhere, which would be good, or if they're going to use tap water. And of course, over time, tap water will cause the soil to become salty because the minerals in the tap water are going to be held by the soil. And for a single time, so it doesn't really matter. But if you have heavy irrigation over time, it will cause the soil to become salty. So this is an example of farming. And one of the things we'll do later on is sustainable agriculture. And this certainly carries out some sustainable practices, such as drip farming. So the environmental impact is probably not that heavy, although they probably use inorganic fertilizers and pesticides from time to time. So for this one, this is the part of the syllabus we're going to be looking at. I'm going to compare and contrast agricultural systems in the Caribbean. And we're going to look at the definition of agriculture and characteristics of agricultural systems with respect to commercial and small-scale farming, including subsistence. And of course, subsistence farming is where you farm purely for your own consumption. Um, this probably is not subsistence. These people intend to sell some of their crops. Well, it's fairly small scale. As I've said, we probably all know people who do a bit of farming on the side, simply to supplement their income. Um, so, as I said, what we're going to look at in this class are just these first two things: definition of agriculture and characteristics of agricultural systems. And then we're going to go into more detail in these in later classes. So, moving on. Agriculture defined, and the definition is the deliberate modification of the Earth's surface through the cultivation of plants and the rearing of animals to obtain sustenance or economic gain. So it involves both plants and animals, and it's either for sustenance, which is subsistence farmers, or economic gain. So here we see an example of a very large farm. Um, and also, it seems all the plants are the same. So it's dealing with monocropping, and monocropping is harmful. Or you could also say agriculture is the intentional planting of crops and raising of domesticated animals. That's another definition of farming. So, what types of farming systems do we have? Well, we have shifting cultivation, where we move from one place to another. And this can be either rotational, where we return to the same spot eventually, or migrational, where we just move around randomly. And then you have pastoral cultivation, where we look after animals. And this can be either semi-nomadism, where people have animals and they move on the cycle according to rainfall and so on, but end up where they started. And total nomadism, where they move around uh, and don't necessarily ever go back to where they started. And then we have settled agriculture. And of course, for settled agriculture, we can have livestock. We'll have tillage and livestock, it says here. Uh, so you can have mixed farming, where you have both crops and animals, or you can have intensive livestock. And I suppose livestock doesn't have to be intensive. It can be further broken down into non-ruminants, such as poultry and pigs, and ruminants. Uh, those are cows for meat, fiber, and milk. I suppose goats are also ruminants, and you can also use them for milk and so on. You have intensive annual crops. These are crops which grow every single year, and it can be either roots and tubers or cereals. And then you have horticulture. Well, horticulture really is flowers and so on. But this thing also includes nuts, fruits, flowers, and vegetables. And then you have perennial crops, where you have trees which uh, grow every single year. And you also have industrial food production, where you have things like cows, pigs, and hens, and so on, all in a single building. So those are the main types of farming system. We have shifting cultivation, pastoral, and settled. Uh, so an agricultural system refers to the method that the farmer makes use of resources for production of food and fiber. And there are basically three types of agricultural system. Shifting cultivation, where we uh, grow crops in one area and then move. Pastoral, where we move with the animal. And then settled. And then there are two types of shifting cultivation. As I said, rotational, when the farmer will return to the original land after exhausting the land. And migrational, when the farmer will move to a new area after exhausting the land. And I suppose for these, well, why do they move? And the point is the land becomes exhausted, thus all the nutrients are removed, and there's a build-up of pathogens. So this shows what rotational cultivation, where you return, well, eventually return to the original land. You slash and burn an area, grow crops, then you go to a next area, grow crops, and you eventually end back where you started. If it's rotational, if it's non-rotational, it's very similar, except you never return to where you were to begin with. So this is something said about shifting cultivation. It's a widely misunderstood agricultural system. People believe it to be primitive. Well, it is primitive. That part is correct. Destructive, and that's not correct. Major cause of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's total nonsense. Um, it does use slash and burn, but not nearly on the scale that is carried out for commercial uh, processes. Um, and the land is given time to recover, and only a small amount is used. So in reality, it's highly productive per labor unit and have high product diversity. That's important. For shifting cultivation, they grow lots of different crops, and therefore product diversity is high. And because product diversity is high, um, it means if as one crop fails, they still have lots of food left. So food security is fairly high. And it's well tested because it's been around for thousands of years without doing any harm. And it maintains biodiversity. And this one says may enrich soils. Well, at least it's not going to harm the soils, which happens with commercial farming. So at worst, it is neutral. So as it says, it's been in the Amazon for centuries, and the Amazon has been fine. But recently, because people want modern forms of farming, the Amazon rainforest is being destroyed. So these are examples of the different crops you find in the Amazon. Uh, the Yanomami, Yanomami, Yanomami are a tribe and found in the Amazon, and they have 16 types of banana and nine types of cassava. The Zingu have 27 crops and with 149 different varieties and 22 types of groundnut. And then this group here have 75 types of chili. Uh, as I said, this wide variety of foods gives rise to greater stability. Remember the idea that the greater variety of crops and so on you have, the greater the stability. And also, some of these crops may have medicinal values that we don't yet know of. And if these lifestyles get replaced, then probably many of these crops will also uh, decrease because modern farming gears more towards monoculture or rearing a small variety of crops. And this simply shows different varieties of banana, purple ones, red ones, and different varieties of chili. We have a large variety of different chilies. They even have a blue banana, which apparently tastes of vanilla. So, what are characteristics of shifting cultivation? So, it's not a static system, and it's adapted to the circumstances and modified over time. So, with shifting cultivation, people adapt according to the changes in the environment. So, it's very adaptable, and it's integrated with hunting and gathering. And of course, hunting and gathering is also a sustainable means of living. The carrying capacity of the population may be low, but it's still sustainable, which is not what is happening in the world today. Agriculture recently has been non-sustainable, and I think in the future there could be severe food shortages because of the agricultural practices we carry out. So there's an extreme diversity of foodstuffs throughout the year. That's important. So with these shifting shifting cultivation, you have extreme diversity, and this gives rise to flexibility. So be careful of the regions they use for cultivation, and plots from shifting cultivation regenerate faster than other clearings. So that shifting cultivation, they clear some land and then cultivate it for a while and then abandon it. But the shifting cultivation regenerates faster, and the abandoned gardens enrich the soil. Uh, it is said that the soil is richer than when it was when they came. So that's why some people say it's beneficial because the soil gets richer after they've been cultivating it for a while. And other characteristics have collective management of a territory. With these large farms, one person tends to own the farm, and therefore you don't have collective management, and therefore there's a lack of social equity. You have poor farmers who don't earn much money, uh, and then you have people at the top who earn a lot, and there's a great gulf between the rich and the poor. So the collective management is a good thing, and sometimes long-term ties to abandoned plots. So the point is, after they've abandoned the plot, they will still consider that land to be theirs, and this causes conflict when people from nearby come and want to take that land over. And you need long fallow periods, uh, sometimes decades, so you leave the land fallow for long periods of time. But this last part is very important. It's the only agricultural system with a proven long-term compatibility with tropical forests and biodiversity. So these people have been in the forest for thousands of years, and biodiversity wasn't affected at all. But with modern technology, uh, the farming methods being employed now are not sustainable, and they've just been around probably for less than 100 years. So these are from South America. This is probably Africa, in the tropical rainforests in Western Africa. And these people, as well, the pygmies, uh, have been farming for thousands of years without any noticeable degeneration of the forest. But rapid degeneration is occurring now with modern farming techniques. So, what are the challenges to these shifting farmers? Uh, Privatization of land. And I said big landowners are coming and taking over their land. And the land which is left fallow is conceived to be not in use, so they can take it over. And there's the expansion of permanent cultivation. We can see this here. Here's the rainforest, and it's being cleared for permanent cultivation of crops. So the rainforest is getting smaller and smaller, and therefore the land available for shifting cultivators is getting less. Then we have misconceptions and negative myths. Uh, as I said, people have misconceptions about shifting cultivation, that it's harmful to the environment and the people are primitive and so on, and therefore we need to enlighten them and move them away from their primitive uh, lifestyle. So misconceptions are harming them. And then government policies. Uh, government is in places like Brazil certainly are encouraging cutting down the Amazon for traditional farming. So government policies stimulating agricultural commodities and not rather than forest food production. And then we have misguided environmental and climate defenders. Um, so some people worried about climate change think these shifting cultivators are harming it. But as this thing says, the key drivers are elsewhere. So that was for external challenges. There are also internal challenges. You have limited territories where shifting cultivation is occurring and the population is increasing. So these people are less able to sustain their population by traditional means. Uh, there's challenges from subsistence farming to market focus. People, instead of the hunter-gatherers, sorry, the shifting farmers are purely subsistence farmers, and there's an incentive for them to make food for the market. Uh, According to this, combinations are possible. Perhaps they could uh, continue to feed themselves and make food for the market. Uh, Sedentarization. Uh, we're more inclined to stay in one spot. We'll have schools, health systems, and infrastructure, and so on, which make staying in one spot uh, more desirable. And of course, we're changing lifestyles and expectations. Probably these shifting cultivators want to stay in one place and get televisions and so on. So, because civilization worldwide is changing, these people also might want to change their lifestyle. And to meet challenges, we can integrate with agroforestry for sustained production. Um, and this mentions the RFN example. And RFN basically says for regenerative food network, where land which has been destroyed, we can try and regenerate it. For example, after fires, and might have heard that recently even the Amazon has been facing forest fires, which didn't used to happen. But the land will need regenerating, and we can use what is called a regenerating food network, and we can use part of it, things like NFTs, where NFT stands for nitrogen fixing tree. So we'll grow lots of crops, well, lots of trees, which are NFTs, and therefore they can add nitrogen to the soil and make it more nutritious. So contain more nutrients for plants to grow in. So for this thing, both are nitrogen fixation, rotation of annual crops on green manure, simply regenerating soil uh, so that it can become forest again. And another thing, we can meet monetary needs through a sale of honey, vegetable oils, and spices, and so on, things which are grown in the rainforest. I suppose you can use things such as the Brazil nut. Uh, Remember, the Brazil nut can only grow in rainforests, and the develop rewards benefits for maintaining ecosystem services. So we can develop, we can pay people for maintaining uh, rainforests as they are. So payment for the ecosystem service must be part of the system. So even a place like Guyana, I suppose, we can people worldwide can compensate Guyana for maintaining its portion of the Amazon. So the recommendations that are made: stop demonizing shifting cultivators. Um, they're not the people who are causing any problems. So acknowledge the rationality and benefits of the system for forest landscape, food security, culture even, and work with local communities to develop alternatives where traditional systems are no longer viable. Um, they should work with the indigenous people rather than trying to change them, and respect communities' customary collective land rights. I suppose that's important for these indigenous people. Recognize they have land rights and don't simply burn the forests down. It says collective rights protect forests. Um, so this is part of the Amazon. That, as I said, remember the Amazon includes Guyana. Then we have pastoral farming, which refers to the raising of livestock. And there are two types have semi-nomadic and nomadic. And one example they are the Maasai, which are a tribe in East Africa. And they live in a simple home and migrate to a new area when the cattle use up the grass. They are semi-nomadic because they eventually return to where they came from. But one of the problems with the Maasai, of course, is that they tend to move from Kenya to Tanzania, so they move across boundaries. And because of international laws and so on, uh, this is not terribly well liked because uh, Kenyan laws and Tanzanian laws aren't quite the same. So are these people Kenyan or Tanzanian, basically? So semi-nomadic people move from one place to another on a seasonal basis. The Maasai, therefore, are semi-nomadic because they return to previously occupied Manyata, and Manyata is uh, the little village in which they live, and they have a large number of different bomas in the Manyata. And the nomadic lifestyle is under threat because of climate change, and developers want to put their land to more productive use. Uh, some developers want to use the land Maasai use for their own purposes. As I said, as this thing says, people have their own oral histories, art, complex languages, and so on, and it has an intrinsic value worth protecting. And another example of nomadic people, the Kochi people in Afghanistan. And again, their existence is under threat because the land which they move around in is being taken over for other people who want it for pasture and that kind of thing. And then we look at peasant farming. And an average peasant farm in Guyana is less than 10 acres in size. and the farmer and family members provide most of the labour, and most of the land is used for growing crops. And peasant farmers grow a variety of crops, including tomatoes, cabbages, peppers, ginger, yams, legumes, and rice. And they usually practice crop rotation. I said is a very uh, good practice because it uh, helps preserve the soil. For instance, small farmers often rotate legumes with peppers or vegetable crops, and peasant farmers often rear some livestock, including chicken stocks and small animals. So they have mixed farming, and the livestock can help to provide manure for the uh, farm. So this is also beneficial. Then farming is done using mostly labor-intensive methods and traditional hand tools. I think one of the points about uh, peasants is they don't have much money and therefore they can't buy expensive tools or fertilizers or pesticides or so on. So they could just going to use traditional hand tools. And several irrigation channels or canals are used to supply crops with water. And manure and compost are used as fertilizers. So we don't use chemical fertilizers that often. So chemical fertilizers may be used as sometimes. So they're used on occasion. And modern methods are sometimes employed, especially for the cultivation of rice. Um, so peasants do have a bit of money but it's fairly rare. So tractors may be used to prepare the land. Again, this is going to be only to a small extent. Chemical fertilizer are used, uh, but only to a limited extent again. Combined harvesters are sometimes hired to harvest the rice when needed. And they can sell some of their rice and things. Then we have subsistence farmers. Um, subsistence farmers, virtually all of their produce they eat themselves. Uh, According to the study guide, uh, it's subsistence farmers who sell surplus to the market, but in reality, peasants do that as well. Um, so really, peasants really are a form of subsistence agriculture. So because the study guide says that subsistence farmers sell to the crops to sell surplus, but peasants do not go along with that because it says it in the study guide. But others will say that peasants, in fact, sell the surplus. So, in fact, the study guide is probably wrong. So, subsistence farmers is a form of farming in which nearly all the crops or livestock raised are used to maintain the farmer and the farmer's family, leaving little, if any, surplus for sale or trade. The pre-industrial agricultural peoples throughout the world have traditionally practiced subsistence farming, and some of these people uh, move from site to site as they exhaust the soil at each location. And as urban centres grew, agricultural production became more specialised, encouraging commercial farming developed, with farmers producing a surplus of crops. Yes, so as urban centres grew, uh, commercial farming developed, and therefore subsistence farming decreased. And there are different types of settled agriculture: tillage and livestock, grassland, and industrial agriculture. And tillage and livestock involves rearing of animals to make their meat and produce, so milk, egg, fiber, sheep, etc. And it can be intensive when a large number of animals are reared in a small area of land, but it's not always intensive. So you have this, which is industrial farming, where you have a large number of chickens in a small area, or for cows or pigs. And it's believed to be uh, cruel for these animals to live like that for all this period of time. You know, their entire life is spent inside of a building. So factory farming, this occurs when animals are raised in large numbers in enclosed buildings, and they are treated with hormones so they will grow quickly, and then slaughtered and processed in the kitchen for ready foods. And factory farms concentrate on maximizing profit. So the effects on the local economies, the health of the farm workers, and the community in general, and the surrounding environment are ignored. So you just want to concentrate on the profit for farm, the farm owners, and local economies might suffer as a result. Uh, well, one thing is the health of the farm workers quite often suffers because the farm workers have to do a lot of work. They and can get diseases from the animals and so on. Um, and the environment is probably not terribly healthy. The factory farms have serious drawbacks. The inhumane treatment of the animals. So if you look, living in conditions like that is inhumane. Genetic manipulation. These animals are often genetically modified. We treat them with antibiotics, and therefore it enables bacteria resistant to antibiotics to develop. And in the future, this will harm people. We have high levels of ammonia and methane. Methane, of course, is a greenhouse gas. Ammonia has a bad smell. Water pollution shall cause eutrophication and so on. It has a land usage. And then what came after this? The farm workers are going to be affected. And then, hold on. They have exploitation of farm workers, and small farmers won't be able to compete, and become bankrupt. And the small farmers, of course, are the farmers who farm, who keep a few cows or so on. They will not be able to compete with these industrial farmers. But farming can also be free range. It seems a lot more humane to keep the animals like that. At least make their lives pleasant while they're alive. It says for these animals kept in industrial farms, the most humane part of their existence is their slaughter. But these animals seem to have a much more enjoyable time when they're still alive. For sheep, pigs and so on. Then you have mixed farming, which uses both animals and plants. And of course, these kind of complement each other. So you can use the cow feces to make manure, which is a fertilizer soil with, and probably parts of the crops can give them to the animals to eat. Because not all the crop will be consumed by people. I suppose you have corn, you take off the cob, and you can feed cows with the rest of the corn and that kind of thing. And another type of farming is growing crops. And then you have annuals, which complete their life cycle in a year. And then you can grow tubers, which grow under the ground. And you have things like yams, cassava, Irish potato, and so on. Then you have horticulture, which are flowers. And then subsistence farming. Um, so what is subsistence farming? I think I said we've done this already. Farmers produce solely for the farmer's own consumption, but leftover can be sold on the market. So the farmer makes a low profit, but it sustains his family. And that's what subsistence farming is about, simply sustaining the family. It's labor intensive. Uh, all members of the family have to work on the farm, and farm work is labor is high. If you ever tried farming, it's a lot of hard work, and there's hardly any technological input because they don't have any money for technological things. And this, I think I've done this already. Then, scale of farming. Some farms are very large. So I said the largest farm in the world is one in China, which is the size of 22,500,000 acres. And for comparison, the whole of Jamaica is simply 2,175,900 acres. So I have farms in China, which are much bigger than the entire country of Jamaica. So traditionally, Jamaica has many large farms. If you look at history, Jamaica was a system of sugar estates, and then we had a bit of coffee as well. So all farms are commercial, though some commercial farms can be fairly small. I suppose that's not quite correct, is it? You probably have some subsistence farming in Jamaica, but not much. Um, and so some uh, people farm commercially but don't get much money from it. It's just a means of supplementing income. You might have taxi drivers or teachers who grow a bit of things on the side, just try and make up a bit more money because salaries tend to be small. But characteristics of commercial farms, they have large scale production. It's capital intensive. It uses high yielding varieties of crops. Its produce is for sale. You have a heavy machinery and human labor. In most cases, one type of agricultural practice is done over a large area. So we carry out monocropping, and the practice is done all year round. So impacts of industrial agriculture, and this is these large farms and so on, where you grow one type of crop. It's harmful ingredients. Uh, that's all we really do is we care about profit. So the health impacts might be high because we're concerned about profit only. Uh, environmental impacts, monoculture. We tend to grow one type of crop. Uh, biotechnology results as a loss of genetic diversity and potentially presents a danger to the environment and health concerns of the consumer. So long term, genetic modification leads to a loss of genetic diversity. That's long term. Because when we use GMOs, we're not going to stop using other plants and we'll only use the GMOs. So they replace what the other plants we're using. So the long term is it decreases biodiversity. Although in fact short term, since you can be introducing new crops into a species, new genes into a species, the short term might be increase, but the long term is a decrease. Then the other impact of the industrial agriculture is use of chemical fertilizers and insecticides and pesticides and so on. And these will have an impact on the rivers and so on, harming them. And the new report released by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uh, has concluded that agriculture and forestry have contributed nearly a quarter of all the global greenhouse gases. And this is largely large-scale farming. The industrial farms are use tractors and use large amounts of inorganic fertilizers and so on. And while fossil fuel usage is still identified as the largest driver of climate change, emissions from livestock, nitrogen fertilizers, and deforestation have significant effects on the warming of the atmosphere. And of course, nitrogen fertilizers really obtain the nitrogen using the Haber process, which gets it from fossil fuels. So, inorganic fertilizers contribute to the greenhouse effect because the Haber cycle, where nitrogen is made, uh, use vast amounts of fossil fuel. Okay, so that basically covers this presentation.